Thanks, Sarah. Tonight we continue the last few weeks on our series through the Gospel of John. We've been tracing this Gospel for a couple of years now, and we got to the death of Jesus around Easter, and because we didn't have a Resurrection Sunday PM service, tonight we look at John chapter 20, which is essentially the chapter where Jesus is resurrected, or at least that is the discovered truth. And we've actually only got 2 more weeks in this John series. We've got to work through chapter 20 today and then 21 the next 2 Sundays. So hopefully, if you haven't caught up with the rest of the series, you can go back to listen to 2 years' worth of messages and you'll be right up to speed tonight. No, actually, tonight is a great opportunity to join in as well, because it is really quite a profound story. And the way that John articulates this particular passage is quite dramatic and provocative and inspiring in so many different ways. And I hope you capture a little bit of what John is doing in the way that he articulates his gospel of Christ's resurrection tonight. Centered in this chapter 20 and this kind of moment of realization that the tomb is empty is this moment of mistaken identity. This kind of is the crux moment in John's gospel, and made me think as I was preparing for this message around situations where perhaps there's been a case of mistaken identity in my life. Now, I have to acknowledge, I don't think I look like any celebrities, and even if I did in Alice Springs, no one cares about celebrities anyway, so you never get a case of mistaken identity. But I remember when I was one time back in Melbourne, which just always makes me laugh. Megs and I were attending a big wedding, and this was a very fancy wedding at it was like a Hilton type kind of ballroom in Melbourne, and it was some Hindu friends of ours who were having this wedding. And if you've ever been to like a Hindu wedding, you know they go for a really long time. So the way that it kind of worked was we would all sit in this massive gallery around these tables. And the wedding kind of would happen at the front. You didn't really have to do anything. It was just kind of happening because it just took a while. You know, there's all these kind of ceremonies and that kind of stuff. You would just eat while this was all happening. And anyway, so we were sitting around these tables, and there would have been at least a couple of hundred people there, maybe even 300 or 400 people. It was a big, big deal for our Indian friends. And the kind of the piece de resistance, should I say, like the kind of the biggest thing for me in this particular situation, which I was not familiar with, is I had this massive chocolate fondue fountain, and it was in the kind of foyer area. And so whenever you wanted to, you could get a plate, walk into the foyer, and you just get fruit and you dip it in this fondue fountain. It was amazing, you know, just like what a great experience, what a great wedding to attend. Anyway, so we were there, and after I'd kind of gone back, you know, kind of second, third time, I had this plate that was kind of stained with like chocolate sauce from previous visits, and I was going to the fondue fountain for another round. There was a lovely Indian lady, older lady, who said to me, "Do you know if there's any more plates?" And I looked over to where the stack of plates were, and she rightly said they were all gone. And I looked at kind of mine, and I'm like, I can't really offer this. This has, you know, the stains of the past. And I said, yeah, sorry, I don't think there's any more. Anyway, she kind of had this kind of almost angry look on her face. And I was like, oh, okay, well, it is good chocolate fondue. Maybe you're just sad at the missed opportunity. I don't really know. Anyway, so she went away, and I got, you know, a bit more chocolate fondue when I went back in, had all that. And then I kind of came back out again. I'm sounding very gluttonous at this point, I know, but this is how it kind of played out. Long wedding. And I came with a plate, and again, this different, lovely older Indian lady came up to me, and this time it wasn't, are there any plates? She said to me, there are no more plates. And I said to her, yeah, I'm really sorry there doesn't seem to be any more plates. I'd offer you mine if I could, but, you know, obviously I'm not going to offer you this plate. Again, angry look, and walked away from me. And I'm thinking to myself, this is very strange. I'm having these very strange interactions. Usually older people actually get along really well with. And then it kind of dawned on me that for the wedding, I was wearing a suit with a waistcoat. And it suddenly dawned on me that among the 400 or so guests, there was probably 2 or 3 of us who were Caucasian. So she thought that I was one of the waiters. And suddenly I realized, oh, right. So I suddenly went back over these situations, go, how offensive must I have been to be like, sorry, there's no more plates. Yeah, there are no more plates. And here I am potentially then moving and feasting on the fondue myself, you know, like it's just great moment of mistaken identity, you know, just a really, really great moment where you suddenly realize like, the context says so much And if we don't understand the context, we can actually kind of miss what is going on. And so with that in mind, and we'll get to that a little bit later, you'll see how much the context of this book speaks to this moment of mistaken identity, which is actually quite profound. We're going to start with John chapter 20. We're just going to work our way through this. There's quite a bit of text tonight, but it's all part of the bigger story. It says here in beginning verse 1, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, the author of the Gospel of John, and said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Now, I think it's really interesting that the initial assumption is that somebody has taken the body. I don't know who they are that she was suggesting, but all she knew is that the body was not there. And so there's this sense of like the body was taken. What's really fascinating about this in and of itself is that in Matthew's gospel, a little bit later on, the soldiers were actually paid by the religious leaders to say that the disciples had taken the body. So both people didn't want the body gone, but nevertheless, this is how it played out, and this is what Mary Magdalene was worried about. Somebody has taken the body, and we don't know where they have put him. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. You hear the drama in this. They're starting for the tomb. What's going on? Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. I love this moment. It's like, what a weird kind of flex moment for the author of the gospel. To be like, hey, by the way, I was the more athletic one, right? And so anyway, it's just this like little like flex moment. Then he bent over and looked at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, bold Simon Peter, came along behind him, the slow one, and then went straight into the tomb. Now, apart from this like really bizarre kind of flex moment from the author, I actually love what the writer is doing here. Because for me, this speaks to the fact that each of us has a different kind of faith journey. And we have a different kind of way of responding to these moments of angst and crisis. You get this kind of John figure who is there and he's fast and he gets there and he almost like tentatively kind of peers in the tomb and trying to work out what is going on. Later we'll find out a little bit more. But Peter, always the bold people, always the one who's stepping out on the water, always the one who's running his mouth off and getting into trouble. He just runs straight in there when he finally gets there, right? And I think for us, this is actually a great reminder. As we have these characters, Mary Magdalene, as we have John, as we have Peter, all experiencing this same kind of trauma, they're all experiencing it slightly differently, and the author is pointing this out. And I think the same can be true of us. When it comes to moments of faith, not just moments of absolute crisis like this, we all navigate it differently. Some of us want to run ahead, but then are tentative when it comes to actually discovering exactly what is taking place. Maybe we suddenly realize there is a pain or a hurt or a possibility and we only just want to kind of peek in on that. Whereas other people kind of barge in full bore, maybe to their strength, maybe to their weakness. Nevertheless, Peter runs in there. And what does he see? He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. And this is a really important detail in this story. I want you to imagine just for a moment that you're hearing this story for the first time. You see, we know how this ends, right? We kind of know what's going on. But if you are hearing this story, this gospel for the first time, what do we know so far? The body is missing. Somebody has taken it. You can hear the drama. Who took the body? Who are they? We have no indication. We have no clues. Then we're running there. Some people are getting there fast. Some people are getting there slow. Some people are peeking. Some people are looking a little bit deeper. And what is the situation? Wait a second. Strips of linen, the headpiece, it is neat. It's neat. It shouldn't be neat. See, you steal a body and it doesn't end up neat. No one steals something and then wraps a linen and puts it perfectly in place. That's not how it works. In fact, this is a really important detail for John because I don't know if you can recall the last time there was a bit of a resurrection story going on, but that was all the way back with Lazarus, his friends. And how is Lazarus described as exiting the tomb? Basically as a zombie figure with all the different bits and pieces still wrapped around him. And so John here is making this really a strong distinction between the resurrection that had occurred with Lazarus and what had happened with Jesus here. Something profound had happening. This was a miraculous loosening, you could say, or loosing. This was not a stolen body. Which, of course, if you're hearing this for the first time, only raises more questions, of course. Oh, well, stolen seemed to be the obvious answer. So what's happened now? Was it just like a robber with just insane OCD, or was something else going on? Because everything was back in place. It was not a stolen body. This was a different kind of resurrection, if we could even call it that. It says in verse 8, finally the other disciple, whenever we say the other disciple, we're talking about John, the author, by the way, who had reached the tomb first, flex again, also went inside. He saw and believed. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it's worth noting that this is a very controversial verse in theological circles, because no one exactly knows what they think he believed, what that even really means. Some people think it was maybe added a little bit later to kind of establish a bit more authority in John's gospel. It's a little bit hard to know exactly, but nevertheless, he saw something and something took place. Because, of course, in verse 9 it says, they, that is both John and Peter, did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. What a bizarre resolution moment, right? Outside of this kind of mysterious verse 8, where maybe John saw something and maybe he believed something, these disciples who were worried that someone had stolen the body had checked out the scene. They'd seen that the body wasn't stolen, but there was still more and more questions. And so what did? They go home. They just leave. They went back to where they're staying. It doesn't tell us about the emotions they were feeling. It just says they went back. And so John, in this bizarre way, leaves the disciples, especially Peter and John, returning to their place with these unanswered questions. This mystery still there. See, this doesn't bode well with us, especially us Western Christians. We want resolution, right? We want him to look in there and say, oh, good thing Jesus is alive. But we're not guaranteed that the disciples were thinking this. In fact, it doesn't suggest this in the text really at all. What I see is Peter and John walking back, maybe together, one maybe slightly faster, who knows, asking the question of themselves, is this over now? Is this whole Jesus thing over? I mean, we'd ask these questions back at his death, but look, what's happened now? Maybe they're asking the question, will we see him again? Their whole experience is filled with questions, not answers. It's so important to recognize the kind of questions that exist within the scriptures themselves. These moments of uncertainty that was so prevalent for the disciples. Sometimes we, as followers of Jesus, we're like, hey, we've got the full picture, we get the complete story, and sometimes we can dismiss the significance of these moments where we have questions and we don't have resolution. We were walking back home without all the answers, just a bit more mystery. Where is God at work here? We thought Jesus was the Messiah. Now he's gone. We may not be looking in his tomb, or we may not be running in, but we have these moments in our own faith expression where we have to ask the question, God, what are you up to? And if we don't recognize that the disciples had these kind of questions too, we can miss a really significant part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and that is trust in the midst of doubt. This is part of what John is wanting to remind us of. And yet, there is another. Don't forget about Mary. It continues. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. So, as someone mentioned to me this week, does that mean Peter and John just kind of ditched her? It's a bit mysterious. If John saw and believed, did he not choose to articulate this to Mary? It's a bit mysterious, isn't it? But nevertheless, they've gone home and Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look in the tomb. Hey, do you recognize those words? Who else bent over to look in the tomb? Earlier in the... John, yeah, right. So, the writer's doing something here. She's looking over into the tomb, just like John did. But instead of seeing strips of linen like John, she saw two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and one at the foot. So suddenly there's this little turning point in the story where John peered in and it arose questions. Suddenly Mary is peering in and we have angels. Now, what do we know about angels? Not that much. Relatively inconsistent, usually from God. But what we do know is that angels carry a message. In fact, the word angel can equally be translated as messenger, right? And when there's a message, usually it comes in the form of a few more answers than it does questions. And so you can see that John is now turning the page and saying, hey, don't give up hope, listeners. There's an answer coming. There's an answer coming. And they asked her, woman, why are you crying? They have taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they have put him. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. I want us to note a few things here just before we move on. Number one, notice how Mary is not freaked out by the angels. Can you find that bizarre? Most angels, when they come, they have to say something along the lines of, peace be with you. All right? That's because John is talking about there is a message coming, right? And there is a messenger and they're going to carry some sort of hope, but actually there's something even bigger coming. And so she turns around and she sees Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. And he asked her, woman, why are you crying? Does that sound familiar? Yeah, it's exactly the same question that the angels asked her just moments ago. But this time it's Jesus. Who is it that you are looking for? Thinking he was the gardener, she said, Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him. Now, I just want to let you know, John is a very smart author. He's doing something here that most of us won't pick up on. But I can guarantee that if you lived in the first century, you would have picked up on it immediately, especially if you're Jewish. Thinking he was a gardener. What a bizarre detail to include in this story. So tell me, when was the last time, or what comes to mind when you think about a single woman in a garden? Are there any other biblical stories that include a woman in a garden? Anything come to mind? What? Adam and Eve. That's right. Notice in John's Gospel, it's only Mary Magdalene. There's only one woman. In the other Gospels, there are multiple women. And here there is one woman in a garden, and she sees someone and thinks it's a gardener. Now tell me, if we're talking about Adam and Eve, who was the first gardener? What did God instruct Adam to do? To look after and take care of the garden that he was placed in. Do you see what John's up to here? Do you see who he is positioning Jesus as? See, there is a story below the story. Now, you might say to me, Gavin, no, you're pushing that way too far. Come on, you're making connections where there aren't connections. Okay, let's just ask the question, how does the Gospel of John start again? In the beginning? Yeah? What does John do throughout his gospel? He refers to the signs. This was the sign, this was the sign, this was the sign. How many signs were there? 7. The final sign being the resurrection of Lazarus, right? And so this final sign, there was a completion, which is what resurrection represents, of course. And then suddenly, we've got a woman in a garden with a gardener. Now, straight after the resurrection of Lazarus, we end up with almost 6 chapters of Jesus preparing for his death. And then we get to this story after his death. John is very deliberate, even starting this chapter with, then on the first day, while it was still dark, with echoes back to the first day of creation and still dark, the tohu vavohu, right? that was referenced in Genesis chapter 1. This is what John is trying to say. Jesus, this Jesus who is alive, is like the new Adam, and a new creation has begun. The invitation to partner with God has been extended again. This is what John is picking up on here. Notice what Paul says. There we go. I've even got it written down for you. Jesus is a new Adam, and a new creation has begun. Paul picks up on this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. If you ever want an incredible chapter to parallel with John chapter 20, 1 Corinthians 15 is insane. But I just want to pick up a little bit here. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, referring to death. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. Right? So when we think about this resurrection story, we've got to think, what God began in the beginning, right, He is renewing through Christ. She confused him with a gardener because he was the new Adam. Again, repeating verse 15, he asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was a gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him and I will get him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. I love this moment. We have this beautiful moment where the revelation moment, this case of mistaken identity shifts when Jesus calls her by name. And this is what God wants to remind us, is in this new creation we are called by name and invited to recognize the risen God. You see, there is a deep part in every single one of us that wants to be known. We want to be seen. We want to be accepted. We want our story to matter. And in these moments of worry, where we feel like there are no answers, where we feel like we are isolated, the thing that we often lose is our ability to believe that somebody understands our circumstances. And that's characterized by our name, our story. And what God does in the midst of those points is He reaches out and reminds us that He knows us, and He knows us by name. And I believe in those moments we recognize Jesus too. I love how in this story 3 times Mary raises the same concern. Somebody has taken his body and I don't know where they have put him. She shares that with the disciples, Peter and John, who would go on to become these incredible leaders of faith. But to be honest, by the end of their portion, there were no answers. She raises this same question with the angels, the people who are the messengers, the kind of intermediaries. And they don't even have an opportunity to answer. But then when she shares it with the gardener, the new Adam, Jesus, He answers her by name. There's this beautiful thing where essentially Jesus is saying, hey, you might be looking, but I found you first. You don't have to see me before I see you. This is the nature of our God. We see but a small part, but God is the one who sees in full. And He carries us, and He carries our story, and He calls us by name in the midst of our anxiety and our fears. We trust in a living God who calls us by name. I love again in 1 Corinthians how Paul articulates it. He talks a lot about love in 1 Corinthians 8. But he concludes a little section by saying, "For now, we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then, in the future, we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, but then in the future, one day, I shall know fully, even as I am fully known." This whole story in John chapter 20 is about seeing in part. these little clues, these unanswered questions, these little reflections. I see what is in front of me. It doesn't make sense, and I'm scared. And a lot of life is like that. Whether we're going through difficult health situations or between jobs, or maybe we've been broken into, or maybe our faith foundations have been shattered in some ways and we're trying to put the pieces back together. We all have these moments where we ask God, where are you? I don't see you. I don't recognize you. I promise you, in these moments, we have a God who is trustworthy, living, and knows us by name. And he calls you by name and invites you to recognize him. Now we only see in part, but one day we shall know fully, even as right now, by our incredible God, we are already fully known. Just like the Peter in this story, the John in this story, the Mary in this story, we're all going to have different expressions of faith. There are going to be times of questions and pain and fear, but God knows us by name. And he calls us to him and a promise of resurrection. The question for each of us is, will we recognize him when he calls? This passage concludes. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them that I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Right? One and the same. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. One day we can talk about the fact that it was bizarre that God chose Mary in that context, and how it makes the resurrection of Christ all the more likely. But for today, whatever you're going through, whatever you're experiencing, whatever changes may be on the horizon, or maybe you're experiencing right now, know that there is a God, a living God, who calls you by name. We may see in part, but he sees us in full. And so that's what we need to trust. Let me pray. Now, Jesus, thank you that the power of your resurrection is not just at work back then, but it's at work today. For you are inviting us to be part of this new creation that is bursting forth. Your invitation has always been to partner with us in the ongoing creation of the world. And God, we don't get it right all the time. But God, thank you that that invitation hasn't changed. But in fact, that you remind us that in the midst of our weakness and our pain, you continue to extend your hand, you continue to extend your voice toward us and remind us that you are the God who knows us and loves us and who is for us. And you are alive. And so, God, with whatever measure of courage and capacity we have right now, running and looking and seeing and understanding and misunderstanding, thank you that you are present and you are at work. And so, God, we trust you. We trust you. In your name, amen.